Hello and happy new year, everyone. And thank you for attending today's webinar in part of a new series called Logistics Launchpad. We have a lot of great content in this program. So if you'd like to join us for the next two webinars in this series, please feel free to register in the top right-hand corner of your screen. Now, before we begin, let's go over a few housekeeping items to make sure everything goes as smoothly as possible. First, on your screen, you can see multiple application widgets that you can use. So please take a moment now to familiarize yourself with each widget that you have. For the slide deck of this presentation, you can expand your slide area or maximize it to full screen by clicking on the arrows in the top right corner. Also, a copy of today's slide deck is available in the additional materials on the bottom left portion of your screen. Now, please be sure to ask questions through the Q&A widget on the right-hand side of your screen. We're going to try and answer as many questions as possible at the end of the webinar. Also, please be sure to use share other webinar topics you'd like us to explore or any comments about the program. Our goal is to share valuable insights, and a quick survey you can see on the bottom right corner. Last but not least, an on-demand version of this webinar will be available shortly after the webinar and can be accessed using the same audience link that was sent to you earlier. Now, our lawyers would like us to add a slide. The takeaway here is that just to keep in mind that all information provided in this webinar is presented based on the situation at this time and may not be customized or applicable to your specific situation. All right, now let's go ahead and dive into today's presentation. First, I'd like to introduce my co-host for today's webinar, Marcy Allstott. I couldn't be more excited to be co-presenting with Marcy today. And when you hear her background, you'll understand why. Marcy is an operations and supply chain executive with diverse product and technology expertise. She's currently a managing director at OnTap Consulting, which specializes in operations, supply chain, sales, and marketing. In Marcy's current role, she focuses on helping customers navigate the journey from innovation to commercialization, which means funding, operations, business to business, and business to consumer logistics networks, as well as scaling companies. Marcy, Happy New Year and welcome to today's webinar.
Thanks, Mike. It's great to be here. And let me introduce Mike. Mike is a sales leader for small and medium businesses at Flexport. His mission is to help make global trade easier for everyone and unlock freight forwarding as a competitive advantage for customers he works with. And how can you beat that? Mike also runs an e-commerce company alongside his wife and has deep firsthand experience with building a physical products business. So he can relate to what we've all experienced in launching products into the world. So great to be here, Mike. And let me get into the content. We're going to talk today about classic mistakes and embracing growth. And our objective here is to share with you some things that we've learned maybe the hard way. We're going to talk first about the costs of those pitfalls. I'll cover supply chain, and Mike will talk about logistics pitfalls. And then we'll summarize with tips and tricks, which are kind of high-level pointers. We'll also save time for Q&A at the end, so enter your questions as Mike mentioned. But before we launch into that discussion, we'd like to get a better understanding of our audience. So we have a poll, and our poll is to answer one question the best way you can that fits your situation as best you can fit it. The first category might be that you're planning a product launch. Second is that you've launched your product and are ramping this year. The third is that you're shipping in the U.S. and you'd like to expand into other regions. And the last is that you're already shipping internationally. Pick one. It doesn't have to be a perfect fit, but we just want to understand where we are with our audience and who we're actually speaking with. We'll give it a second. We'll close the poll. Okay, Mike, I think you can probably go to the next. Okay, so we have a bit of a mix. Some of our participants are already shipping internationally. They could probably share some pointers with us as well. And we have maybe 20% or so who are planning a launch and trying to learn probably from those of us who've actually launched products. So a pretty good mix across the scope there, which is great. So let's get going with the content. The cost of pitfalls is large. And in my experience, a company's success is one part great technology, one part leadership, and one part execution. And the execution part and the leadership part really is all about avoiding those pitfalls. Most entrepreneurs want to focus on growing their company. They want to focus on the competition, on launching a great product. They don't want to work on recovery from a problem. Half of the startups out there will not make it past 5 years, and oftentimes that's due to stumbling across one of these problems, and money is often the problem that results, lack of money. Those mistakes can actually be avoided, and the results of avoiding those mistakes are that you end up with a longer runway and you can focus on the things you want to focus on. So good reasons to talk about those pitfalls. If you go to the next slide, Mike, my focus today is going to be on the supply chain side. And as I mentioned, Mike will talk about logistics. The big ones for me are complexity, lack of planning, and not enough attention paid to cash flow. And of course, those are all interrelated. Let's take a look at product complexity. Product complexity is many-fold, but one of the ways to describe it is the number of stock keeping units you end up launching. That is a decision often that's made early in the design process and should be really considered early in the design process. What is the minimum viable product required for your customer satisfaction? Do you need variety, or can you solve the majority of your customers' needs with a simple release? The advantage of that simple release is that you're able to learn from your customer base and then add complexity as you go. The downside of releasing complexity, color, variation, options, are that you've got to predict that demand. And usually you're not right. And usually you end up with the wrong inventory, either too much or too little of what you need. And that can result in scrap, and it also can result in availability issues. I had one consumer company that I worked with in the past that felt certain that they needed to launch with 7 colors. They did that. They learned that only 3 of those colors were popular, learned kind of the hard way. And the other 4 that they offered were just slow moving. And so we had to rework. We ended up with not enough of the 3 colors that were popular. And then maybe the worst outcome of the situation is that they had to relaunch in order to kind of reset with the customers what their offerings would be. So avoiding that complexity and considering that earlier in your development is the way to go. You can actually avoid some of that complexity, as I mentioned, with either just a simple release or releasing sort of a superset of capability, You can add functionality with software later. You can consider what's called postponement, which is to add that variety either at your 3PL or the end of the production line. Isn't quite as good, but better than building from scratch with variety. So there are ways of getting around it and solving the customer demand challenge. The next area that I wanted to talk about is a lack of rollout planning. And the pictures on the slide here are interesting. The top picture is of Alex Honnold, who free climbed El Capitan in 2017. He walked to the bottom of that face. He chalked up and climbed. He had no ropes. He had no team. He didn't use any safety harness. Don't do that. That's not a good idea. So the picture on the bottom is the opposite. Bring the team. Make sure you think of the risks, count your costs, have some backup plans. Rollout planning has to do with when and where you're going to ship your product. There are inventory implications, tariff implications, importation complexities, language implications, labeling, documentation, regulatory challenges as you expand your geography on rollout. If it's possible to launch simply to start with and then learn from your customers, that ends up being a much easier way to go. If you do need multiple regions, just understand the complexity of that and make sure you plan for it early. Oftentimes you can test for and design for multiple regions without actually shipping to those multiple regions on launch, and then add that as you go. The last point here, know your customer, was on the last slide. Know your customer. That's important. Understand what they're going to require, where they're going to be purchasing, where are your customers. And that's best understood once you launch. So frankly, the ability to know your customer only improves as you get data, and that data ends up being very, very critical. The third area to focus on is cash control. Money-related issues is one of the biggest reasons for startup failures. And of course, running out of money can have many root causes, but understanding where you stand with cash is king as in a startup, is critical. And I don't just mean, paying attention to the money that's going out. I'm talking about actually modeling it. Consider when you'll need to pay for what and plan for the unexpected. Think about what scenarios could take place and understand what that will do to your cash. Consider material lead time, your terms with your suppliers, where your finished goods inventory is in channel, what your payment terms are with your customers. When will that cash actually show up? There are, unfortunately, too many stories of struggles that companies have, even if they're successful. One consumer company I'm familiar with actually sold $25 million last year in revenue with a 65% margin. That sounds like cause for celebration. But the problem they're having is they are running out of money. They actually are overextended. A lot of that has to do with their success. They have to buy a lot of inventory ahead of time. But they didn't do the right job in planning. And oftentimes you can, if you can anticipate that cash challenge coming up, there are ways you can fund that period, such using backlog actually as kind of your capital, and cross that chasm. But you do need to know it's coming. You can't last minute react to that. So modeling it is important, and understanding your bill of material, cost of goods sold, which is more than just your BOM cost, understanding the full markup of your product. What is it going to cost you to get that product to your customer? and what kind of contingencies do you need to have in case something slows down in your release. So those are the big three for me. I'm going to turn it over to Mike for some logistics pitfalls.
Marcy, thank you so much for walking through those three pitfalls on the supply chain side. I think it's highly valuable. I can say that from personal experience. I think looking at the mistakes there, my wife and I with our e-commerce business made about every mistake that you listed getting to where we are today. I think the color one is a trap that's pretty easy to fall into because it's easy to, you go through all the work producing, making a product, and that's pretty intensive. And then you get to that point and it's like, okay, well, I could, add some color variations. That's pretty easy because you are just working with your supplier to have the same product, but different colors. And it's easy to add a bunch. And we actually did that with our launch that we had for this last holiday season. And the issue was that, exactly as you said, we didn't guess right. And we thought we knew what the best colors would be. It was quite the opposite. And now we have some inventory sitting in a 3PL and we're trying to figure out what to do with next steps. So it's highly valuable. I'm excited to dive in now to the logistics side. Now, before we do that, I have some pitfalls that I see with the customers that I work with. These are business owners all the way up to international companies, with tens of employees. So before I get into the specifics, I'm curious what your biggest worry for those attending the webinar is for 2021, because I know the pitfalls I see on my side, but I'm curious if that's different from what you're experiencing right now, since there's so much change and difficulties in the market. So if you wouldn't mind selecting one of the three options here, which one resonates most, whether that's not forecasting demand correctly, maybe COVID and the changing, environment could either increase or decrease your forecast, and you're not as certain with the numbers. The second one would be successfully navigating the current volatile air and ocean markets. We'll get into more detail here too, but there's definitely a lot of volatility, sky high rates, and a lot of challenges with getting space and understanding when shipments are actually going to move. And then last but not least, of course, is running out of cash. This can happen for more than one reason and is quite common. So we included that as a potential answer there too. So I'll just give it a couple seconds here while you make your choice between these big three, and then we'll look at the results. All right, so it looks like we definitely have a front runner here, which is the volatile air and ocean markets. That really doesn't surprise me. I think 9 out of 10 calls that I have a day are about navigating the current market, and we actually have some more details there that'll be helpful. If you have any questions on navigating the market too, it'd be great to put them in the Q&A. I'm more than happy to dive into those when we get to the Q&A. And then not forecasting demand correctly is in the second spot with about 30%, so a third of the participants. And, that's not surprising either. I think with, retail expanding, when we're seeing unexpected demand increases, as well as COVID, that can affect businesses in a lot of ways. And we actually have a product that, quote unquote, took off this Q4. January is looking big. And my wife and I are trying to understand, is this the new norm, or is it going to settle down? Because that can be a lot. The difference between it staying there and it settling down can be tens of thousands, if not more, units, which is substantial. Running out of cash was 9.3, so not as top of mind given the challenging market and things fluctuating as much as they are. And from my experience too, there's more ways to get capital and fun projects. So those answers and the distribution there makes sense. So we'll dive into a lot of that in the slides to come here. So the pitfalls that I'm seeing, a lot of these are top of mind, are the ones you see listed here. I think a common misconception is that freight forwarding and logistics is simply moving things from point A to point B. Now, although this is apparent, obviously an important piece of the equation, I think there's a lot more that goes into running a highly successful supply chain, especially in the fast-changing dynamic markets like we're in today. So in my experience working with hundreds of customers, probably thousands at this point, I typically run into these three pitfalls. The good news is that many of these can be mitigated or avoided altogether with the proper planning. So let's go ahead and dive into poor data. This is counterintuitive. Again, I speak with a lot of customers, and it often seems, that logistics is still viewed in some part about just getting things from point A to point B. But I think the customers that I work with that are highly successful and running pretty sophisticated supply chains are doing that effectively because they're really leveraging data. For most customers, though, they're tracking and organizing data manually or not at all, and that can lead to a lot of pretty critical issues. At a high level, data is critical for making several key decisions for your company. It's which products to continue with, which products to phase out, what types of products to launch in the future, how to forecast profit percentage and cash flow. So a lot can be done here if done correctly. And when it's done manually, the challenge I see is the time required and then actually the accuracy of that data as well. So let me give you a couple of examples that I've seen with customers and how they leverage data. The first is going to be landed cost per SKU. So this information here involves a lot of pieces, and in the market today, it's jumping up and down. It's higher than expected. So to be able to get this data accurately and in real time is absolutely critical. Shameless plug for Flexport, but it's one of the things that we do is digitize the commercial invoice, packing list, and all the commercial documents. So this information can be pulled and displayed really quickly. Because the thing to know is that, getting the data is actually not the time intensive part. It's analyzing that data and then making decisions and figuring out the consequences and the next steps from those decisions. So you need to be able to get that information quickly so you can get things and understand your actual profit, cash flow, which products are doing well, et cetera. The next one would be average time from when your cargo is ready to when it's picked up, and cargo ready date to delivery. So I think the average time from cargo ready date to pickup is an interesting point, because I do see customers using this piece of data to hold their suppliers accountable. If you have multiple suppliers and they're producing similar products, and you can see, when it's ready to, when it's picked up, you can see those timelines. And if product is actually not ready when it's supposed to, and you're seeing differences there, you can actually take that information to your supplier, and I've seen this done, to hold them accountable and understand, one, is this actually the normal time for production? Is this what should be expected going forward? Or two, are there actual issues that are happening, and can we resolve those and improve that time going forward? Cargo ready date to delivery is great for running lean inventories. Although it is somewhat hard to forecast with the market now, and demand spiking and COVID having an impact. When you do have the data to see what is to be expected for deliveries, you can run as close as you can to just-in-time supply chain. This is really important for a lot of customers I work with that are going through Amazon FBA, for example, because storage limits are being reduced, and you need to be able to make sure that you don't have excess inventory and incurring storage charges, which seem to be ever increasing at this time. And last but not least is quote to invoice. This one is really important. It's basically looking at, what is the difference between what I was originally quoted and what I was invoiced. And I have an interesting customer story here. They were moving shipments DDP, which basically meant the supplier was handling the shipment end to end. And they weren't checking this piece of information. And once we moved a shipment for them, we actually saw that what we were invoicing was significantly less than what we quoted. The reason being is that the supplier was providing a quote based on certain weights and chargeable volume, but it wasn't the actual weight and volume. So when it got to the airport and we actually weighed it and measured it, the dimensions and volume were less than what the supplier was using for their metric. So we were actually able to save them a little over 20K on just a handful of shipments, just because we were looking at the data and the invoiced amount was based on the actual weight and volume. So that's just a few ways that data can help your supply chain and for you to be able to make better decisions for your business. And so I highly encourage you to think through how you're leveraging data, what data you're getting, and what decisions you're making with that information. Next is last minute planning. So we've touched on this point a couple of times. It never hurts to go over it again, but it's more imperative than ever, as we all know, to coordinate as early as possible with your freight partner. And this often means working closely and proactively with your freight forwarder and to outline the strategy and what to expect. Now, the reason why this is important, to give some examples, is a lot of customers I work with don't truly realize the complexity that exists in the market and how little pieces of information can actually have a big impact. So for example, a lot of customers that I'm working with right now don't know that Ningbo is one of the most congested and risky ports to try and ship from at the moment. We're working with a lot of customers, and when it makes sense, we're actually paying for the additional trucking to get shipments to Shanghai. There's more options and more sailings that are moving product out of that port as of today. Now, that's not to say things are going well at Shanghai, but they are going better in Ningbo. And for important launches and when you're really trying to move product, you need to know these facts to make the best decisions for your business. Another great example is that a lot of customers don't realize that there are over 10 premium ocean services in the market right now. And a lot of these services just recently came to market. Now, they all differ in some way, whether it's space protection or equipment priority, whether it's expedited ocean, so a faster direct sailing, there's expedited rail options, et cetera. So really understanding the ports you're coming out of, what the challenges are there, what types of premium ocean services to lock in to mitigate that risk is more important than ever. And so you can get in contact with your freight forwarder as soon as possible, even if it's 3, 4, 5 weeks ahead of when the product's going to be ready. Taking the time to outline these details is really critical. All right, last but not least, our supply chain evolution. So I work with a lot of customers long term, and one thing I've I've noticed is that supply chains and what's happening with the business rarely, if ever, stays the same, whether that's a new supplier, a new product, a new mode of transportation. There's always changes that come up. And the thing when this happens, it can feel like you have your supply chain set up and maybe you're just changing, say, a warehouse, for example, in the United States. I was working with a customer, they got a new 3PL, and it actually took, a fair amount of time to work with their new 3PL to understand the delivery requirements, the SLAs that they needed, and how to best plan. For this 3PL, they needed, around 5 days notice before delivery. They had increased restricted delivery instructions because of COVID, and the specific port that we were coming into was highly congested. So what we ended up doing was setting it up to where they had 10 free days once it reached the port instead of 5. We looked at those options. It's more expensive, but you limit and mitigate the risk of detention and demurrage for your shipment sitting and not getting delivered. So when there's extra constraints in the market, exploring options like the number of free days can be really critical to reduce additional charges that can come up in markets like this. So anytime anything changes, reach out as early as possible. The market could be different. What we advise could be different. And it really does change pretty frequently. So it never hurts to reach out and plan ahead of time. All right, great. So we went through a lot of information there. Now, I'm always curious to see, we have one last poll here. And I'm really curious because we went through a lot, and I am always interested in seeing what the trends are in the market. I do think we can see that we're starting to move to a more digital environment, but I'm curious where people are at in this webinar. So the question is, how are you currently tracking landed cost per SKU? Cargo ready date to final delivery and quote to invoice, is that done manually with Excel spreadsheets and Google Docs? Are you not tracking it at all currently? Or do you have an automated process with technology set up? All right, so it looks like the largest portion here at 63% is manually, and that's with Excel spreadsheets, Google Docs, and other processes. Now, the thing to point out here, this isn't to say that you shouldn't have started here or it's a bad thing to be here. I work with a lot of business owners, and you do have to choose where you spend your time, and there can be priorities where you're launching a product or starting the business that do require your full attention. And so setting up some of these systems and processes might not be top of mind, and I do see it. It's common. The thing I would say is just, keep that seed planted, and as you look forward, especially if you're in an environment where your business and your products are growing, the importance of this data is often more important because you can find yourself, if your business grows and you're looking down the line, the amounts of freight spend and product spend start to exponentially increase. And so making sure you have a system that is automated that can give you this information, if only to pulse check of where you're at, what's happening, to see if anything should be flagged, to dive in deeper. That's what I see a lot. So if you don't have technology, totally okay. One thing I would think about is, getting some technology just to do some high level checks. You don't have to go from doing things in Excel to having everything automated and having a fully blown out technology process. It can just be checks on like landed cost per SKU, over time, for example, just to make sure you know those numbers and you're doing checks like that. A couple of folks, looks like they're not tracking it at all currently. I typically see that when people are just starting out, because the focus is on the product, and that would be what I would guess would be the situation there. And then last but not least, folks do have some automated processes using technology. That's a third of our audience today. So that's great to see as well. Again, just curious. It's always interesting to see where people are at and where the trends are going. So given that a lot of people are still doing things manually, I do see this space getting a lot of investment in the future. A lot of great products and services coming out, which will be exciting to see. Okay, so before we go to the Q&A section, so that is coming up. So I do see some great questions, a lot about the market and how to plan in the current environment. So keep those questions coming. We'll be getting to those in just a second here, and it does look like we're going to have some time to answer a few questions, which is great. So want to summarize the tips and tricks here of what to do right. So you have that in front of you. I think Marcy and I got together, and these are the things that we think, if done right, can really add value and help you avoid the pitfalls that we discussed. Marcy, we have a few points here. I'm curious, of these, which one you would think is the most important from what you've seen with the work that you do with your customers?
Yeah, great, Mike. First, let me say your review of logistic pitfalls is really interesting and helpful, even to me, understanding Ningbo and what's going on there. And I especially resonated with the knowledge of your quote to invoice, that difference, and making sure that you're aware of the data. And maybe that it leads into what I would say is my favorite tip and trick, which is the point about modeling cash flow. And it's really a point about instrumenting your costs and thinking through where your money will be going as you ramp your product. And as I mentioned earlier, that starts with your product, your bill of material, your cost of goods sold, which is everything that goes along with getting the product to the customer. Especially during these volatile times, thinking through what might be out of the norm and planning for that is important. It can make the difference between break even and losing money, or making money and losing money. It also helps you as you're trying to talk with your investors. You need to know how you're spending money, and they need to know that. It's important that you are very fluent in that language. So much so that we are actually going to be focusing on that topic at the next webinar in this series. So if you look at your top right-hand corner, there's the sign up, as Mike mentioned earlier. On February 10th, we'll be talking about the cash flow aspect of launching a product. So that'll be a focus. There are a bunch of good tips and tricks on this list. And I think we've covered most of them in the discussion so far. One thing that we didn't list here explicitly, but I wanted to call out, is controlling your bill of material. That has something to do with your planning and your control over the product and the cost of goods sold. But it also is maybe a little bit different in that really knowing what your bill of material is and controlling that BOM revision level is a critical part of a successful company. So that one wasn't explicitly listed, and I wanted to call it out. But Mike, what do you see as the most critical tips or tricks on this list?
Yeah, so for me, I always go back to I'm going to cheat here a little bit, and this is 2 for 1, but it's the data and working with subject matter experts like yourself. I think there's research you can do on your own for sure, but the most valuable insights you're going to get are from actually tracking the numbers and working with folks that have been in this industry for quite some time. I think that's those partners are key as you scale, because as you scale, the complexity scales as well. So I would make sure you have a way of getting data easily, and you have a trusted partner that you're working with to make sure that you're looking ahead as well as solving what's right in front of you. So with that in mind, I am curious, Marcy, I know you have a great team at ONTAP. If people have been a part of this webinar and are curious about how to contact you and your team, how would they do so?
Great, thanks for the question there. We actually would love to talk with you. We do have conversations all the time with startup companies who are considering engaging experts, and that's what we are. We're a group of experts who have been in supply chain logistics, manufacturing for a very long time, and have many stories and tools that we can bring to bear on your company and your challenges. There is a link on the screen that you're looking at on the lower left-hand corner that will take you to our ONTAP website. You can fill in a form there with specific questions. We'd be happy to reach out and have a conversation. We do it all the time and enjoy learning about your challenges, and perhaps there's a way we can engage and help. So feel free to reach out. Okay.
Cool.
Great, thank you. I think we can go to some questions now. And I, like you, see a lot of good ones that have come in. Let me start with kind of a simple one for you, Mike. What tips do you have for upcoming shipments, especially now with everything going on? What would you recommend people do to deal with what they know is coming in from other areas?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm going to try and be as efficient and effective with my answer here. I see a lot of great questions coming in from Emily, Christina, Daniel, Bradley, Kim. So I'm gonna go through bullet point fashion here. These are general tips. Again, depends on your exact situation, but for some general principles, I would say book at least 3 to 4 weeks in advance of your cargo ready date. That will give your freight forwarder and their partners the time that's necessary to reserve space. And space is pretty packed and full. And so you want to get those bookings in as early as possible so your partner can reserve space. You'll book premium shipments whenever possible. Now, premium shipments don't always guarantee that your shipment is going to move on a specific date. It depends on the options that are available. So make sure to work closely with your provider to understand which options are available given the port you want to come out of, so you can make the best choice there. But I would say premium is the way to go right now for ocean. General cargo not booked on premium, we're seeing higher roll rates in the industry. So if you have time-sensitive shipments that can't go by air, then you definitely want to be looking at premium whenever possible. Next would be to book 40-foot containers versus 45-foot high cube containers. Reason being is the equipment shortages. So worth pointing out, whenever you hear in the industry or news or someone say equipment, it's the containers. Not sure why we don't say just containers, because that would be more clear to me. But hey, book 40-foot containers. The reason being is that there is an extreme shortage of the high cubed containers. A lot of them are actually sitting in the United States and haven't been exported back. So we're seeing a lot of difficulties there. And then, as I mentioned before, Ningbo has severe delays right now. And also a lot of people don't know that Vietnam as well is seeing a lot of struggle. So if you're coming out of those markets or ports, definitely coordinate even earlier to try and see what your options are and what the best way is to plan. So great question there. The next one that I see coming through is how does a small company negotiate terms with a CM? I think a CM would be a contract manufacturer in this question. Isn't it hard to do with little revenue, track record, et cetera? Marcy, I think that one's in your wheelhouse, so I'll pass that question to you.
Sure. Yes. First of all, do negotiate terms with the CM. Even if you're small, that conversation should start when you are discussing options with, choices. You've got choices. That should be a conversation you have before you pick your CM. Many CMs are willing, contract manufacturers, suppliers are willing to extend terms with certain conditions, and you should know what those conditions are. So if you can have that conversation early, you can understand what they're looking for. Typically, it's a well-funded company with a revenue stream. Perhaps you don't start out with a revenue stream, but you may be well-funded, and that may give you an edge and allow you to negotiate terms, even if they're somewhat dependent on your cash in the bank or your credit score. That will change over time. So oftentimes when you're beginning the relationship with a contract manufacturer, you don't have much of a track record, but you know that will happen over time. You want to make sure that there's a process in place to have that discussion on a regular basis and that they understand your expectations. Many suppliers will indeed give you terms for payment, even out of the chute, assuming you've got the right kind of background in payment record and credit score, et cetera. Never hurts to ask and push for that. So please do that. And then again, put a process in place to improve that over time. It's hard as a small company to position yourself as a big player, but I think we often help companies with that, and part of the trick, so to speak, is to communicate the long-term plan for your company. So in effect, when you're working with your suppliers, you are marketing your company. Yes, they're your supplier, you're the customer, but in this case, they're taking a stake to some extent in your company, and you need to sell them on your future. So that ends up being a big part of what we do as we begin a conversation with contract manufacturing options. And then you codify that in an MSA that takes you forward into your product launch and ramp. But those, as we mentioned earlier, cash is king, modeling cash is important. Think about that early. So that's the answer to that question. Mike, I think
I actually have one that I see here at the top from Yvonne is what does design with postponement in mind mean? Sorry if I interrupted you. The audio kind of cut back and forth there, but did you get that question that I just said?
The design with postponement in mind question?
Yes.
Yeah, I see that one. Let me address it. Design with postponement in mind means to design thinking through how to add that variation at the end. At the end, ideally, would mean potentially at the customer. So if you can add software capabilities at the customer, upgrade the customer, that is the best alternative, because then you can ship one product and upgrade it potentially in the field. If you can't do that, perhaps there's a way to add in power cords or additional options at the 3PL that you're working with, so that you build all the same and you add variation in, at the last minute prior to shipping. And then the next best thing is to add that variation in at the end of your production line. So if you do have to have color, or you do need to have power options, or some variation in combinations of your product, try to design the product such that the same thing is built through the line, and then that differentiation is added as late as possible in the process. That will keep you, at least in your production manufacturing facility, on track with a reasonable forecast, and then you quickly differentiate at the end based on real-time data. So that's what I mean by design with postponement in mind. Think through that as you begin your process.
Got you. Great. Now, I do see a few questions that are highly related. These are questions coming from Daniel, Bradley, and Kim. So I'm going to group these together and then walk through. For you three folks, if I don't cover a specific point, please be sure you can ask another question for me to clarify. So the question is, well, what are good places to get intel on port changes or delays? Is that directly from freight forwarders, or are there other sources you use? That's similar to the other one where it's, how can small companies with very few operational folks most effectively manage all the planning tasks that are needed for logistics? And how will the freight market be likely after CNY? What should we expect to see in the ocean and air freight rates? So two or three questions that are related, so I'll dive in. So from my experience, the best place to get intel is directly from your partner and your freight forwarder. There are some sources to get some information, but in today's market, that can literally change in a day. It's important to talk with people that are on the ground, have teams directly in the countries where shipments are coming from. Not only that, a lot of people don't know that freight forwarders can be in different positions. So it's hard for there to be sources that give advice in general what to do for your specific situation. And what I mean by that is that the way that freight forwarders, for example, procure space is different. How much space they have available can vary. The relationships they have with carriers can vary. So it's important to talk to the specific freight forwarder that you're working with or considering working with to understand their capabilities. Flexport, for example, we have locked in additional space from Shanghai to LA recently. That's not something that everyone has access to, and every provider is going to have things that they can talk about or provide. So it's very specific. So I would talk directly with the experts there. And then as far as the freight market in general after Chinese New Year, I think we're, unfortunately going to see a lot of the same, at least in the beginning. We're seeing, a fair amount of shipments getting rolled and space being really tight. I think that's going to continue after Chinese New Year. What we do hope to see, hopefully, as that wanes down, in the months after, is that it does loosen up a little bit, and we're able to start moving, confidently shipments that are not just booked on premium, and there's more space and allocation in the market. Because generally, demand goes down after Chinese New Year. We will see if that's the case. If there's anything we've learned in 2020, is that things can happen that we can't predict. But I would definitely say speak with your freight forwarder to see what they're seeing. A lot of what I do, I actually have a meeting today with one of our ocean leaders, is to understand the market and what's happening as of today. I have these meetings consistently because it's changing that rapidly. So I would definitely keep checking in as much as possible to stay up to date. And then it says, how can, so going to the question about how they can effectively manage all the planning tasks and what's needed. I would say, for me, I work at Flexport, and I think we have a great system where, as I mentioned before, we digitize the supply chain. So that's how you get the information, right? A lot of times this information is provided in PDFs, which isn't as helpful because that information, like, number of units, cost per unit, the weights, the DIMs, none of that is pulled off the document in order to analyze. So you have to do that manually yourself or not at all. And we see that a lot of people are doing it manually, right? So I would say Flexport is a great option. When you're working with other providers, it's a question to ask too, is like, how do you track these pieces of information and data and see where they're at? So great questions. Thank you there. I see. Oh, I do see, Christina had a similar question there as well around what technology to use. I do think Flexport is a great place to start. If you want to reach out, we're always happy to take a call. You can simply go to our website and book some time to speak with an expert there, and we can walk you through how everything works in greater detail and how it specifically applies to your business. Got a question here. Marcy, did you want to add anything on those topics, or are we good to?
No, I think those answers are great, and I think you've done a good job, summarizing. I think if you can comment on how smaller companies can navigate, it is more difficult, I think, for companies that don't have a big stream of revenue flowing to get the information that they need. Any tips on how they can get what they need?
Yeah, so I would say too, if you don't have things set up, working with ONTAP is a great place to start. And so reaching out and understanding just the schedules, the times, what your production is looking like to get that information and start getting a plan together. I think it's similar in a sense to the supplier situation that you outlined, in that I do see people that, haven't had a lot of momentum yet, being fearful to, outline these plans and really trying to partner with a professional, because it's often viewed that that's only for larger companies. But that's not the case at all. Professionals that are doing a great job should always be, happy to take those conversations and support the decision-making process and outline things to think about. So again, I think it comes back to working with professionals, finding someone that you can partner with that can walk you through things to think about.
Yeah, that's great. And I think that's appreciated. I think people do feel sort of afraid to ask. And I think that is, it's good advice to say that you can ask the questions, you can get the information even early on before you've got that stream of shipment moving. You can get the expertise that you need to help you.
Yeah, definitely. So I'm looking at the time here. I think we've run up. I do see maybe one. I'm trying to make sure we answered everyone's question, and it looks like we did. So that wraps up all the Q&A here. So want to say thank you all very much for participating. I know the beginning of the year is a busy time, and so I appreciate you carving out some time to speak with us today. I hope you found some nuggets to take away that can help you and your business. And, we provided ways to contact us, and we hope to connect with you, learn more about your business and how we can help. So have a great rest of your day. We look forward to seeing you on the future webinars for this Launchpad series. and we'll talk soon. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Have a good day.